Section 7 of Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Inatsu Nitobe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Sword, the Soul of the Samurai, and The Training and Position of Woman. From these bloody institutions, as well as from the general tenor of Bushido, it is easy to infer that the sword played an important part in social discipline and life. The saying passed as an axiom which called the sword the soul of the samurai, and made it the emblem of power and prowess. When Mahomet proclaimed that, quote, "the sword is the key of heaven and hell," end quote, he only echoed a Japanese sentiment. Very early the samurai boy learned to wield it. It was a momentous occasion for him when, at the age of 5, he was apparelled in the paraphernalia of samurai costume, placed upon a go board. Footnote: the game of go is sometimes called Japanese checkers, but is much more intricate than the English game. The go board contains 361 squares and is supposed to represent a battlefield, the object of the game being to occupy as much space as possible. End footnote. And initiated into the rites of the military profession by having thrust into his girdle a real sword instead of the toy dirk with which he had been playing. After the first ceremony of adoptio per arma, he was no more to be seen outside his father's gates without this badge of his status, even if it was usually substituted for everyday wear by a gilded wooden dirk. Not many years pass before he wears constantly the genuine steel, though blunt, and then the sham arms are thrown aside, and with enjoyment keener than his newly acquired blades, he marches out to try their edge on wood and stone. When he reaches man's estate at the age of 15, being given independence of action, he can now pride himself upon the possession of arms sharp enough for any work. The very possession of the dangerous instrument imparts to him a feeling and an air of self-respect and responsibility. Quote, "He beareth not his sword in vain." End quote. What he carries in his belt is a symbol of what he carries in his mind and heart: loyalty and honor. The two swords, the longer and the shorter, called respectively daito and shoto, or katana and wakizashi, never leave his side. When at home, they grace the most conspicuous place in study or parlor. By night, they guard his pillow within easy reach of his hand. Constant companions, they are beloved, and proper names of endearment given them. Being venerated, they are well nigh worshipped. The father of history has recorded as a curious piece of information that the Scythians sacrificed to an iron scimitar. Many a temple and many a family in Japan hoards a sword as an object of adoration. Even the commonest dirk has due respect paid to it. Any insult to it is tantamount to personal affront. Woe to him who carelessly steps over a weapon lying on the floor! So precious an object cannot long escape the notice and the skill of artists, nor the vanity of its owner, especially in times of peace, when it is worn with no more use than a crozier by a bishop or a scepter by a king. Shark skin and finest silk for the hilt, silver and gold for the guard, lacquer of varied hues for scabbard, robbed the deadliest weapon of half its terror. But these appurtenances are playthings compared with the blade itself. The swordsmith was not a mere artisan, but an inspired artist, and his workshop a sanctuary. Daily he commenced his craft with prayers and purification, or, as the phrase was, quote, he committed his soul and spirit into the forging and tempering of the steel. End quote. Every swing of the sledge, every plunge into water, every friction on the grindstone was a religious act of no slight import. Was it the spirit of the master, or of his tutelary god, that cast a formidable spell over our sword? Perfect as a work of art, setting at defiance its Toledo and Damascus rivals, there is more than art could impart. Its cold blade, collecting on its surface the moment it is drawn the vapors of the atmosphere, its immaculate texture, flashing light of bluish hue, its matchless edge, upon which histories and possibilities hang, the curve of its back, uniting exquisite grace with utmost strength, all these thrill us with mixed feelings of power and beauty, of awe and terror. Harmless were its mission, if it only remained a thing of beauty and joy, but ever within reach of the hand, it presented no small temptation for abuse. Too often did the blade flash forth from its peaceful sheath. The abuse sometimes went so far as to try the acquired steel on some harmless creature's neck. The question that concerns us most is, however, did Bushido justify the promiscuous use of the weapon? The answer is unequivocally no. As it laid great stress on its proper use, so did it denounce and abhor its misuse. A dastard or a braggart was he who brandished his weapon on undeserved occasions. A self-possessed man knows the right time to use it, and such times come but rarely. Let us listen to the late Count Katsu, who passed through one of the most turbulent times of our history, when assassinations, suicides, and other sanguinary practices were the order of the day. Endowed as he once was with almost dictatorial powers, repeatedly marked out as an object for assassination, he never tarnished his sword with blood. In relating some of his reminiscences to a friend, he says, in a quaint plebeian way peculiar to him, quote, "I have a great dislike for killing people, and so I haven't killed one single man. I have released those whose heads should have been chopped off. A friend said to me one day, quote, 'You don't kill enough. Don't you eat pepper and eggplants?' End quote. Well, some people are no better. But you see that fellow was slain himself. My escape may be due to my dislike of killing. I had the hilt of my sword so tightly fastened to the scabbard that it was hard to draw the blade. I made up my mind that though they cut me, I will not cut. Yes, some people are truly like fleas and mosquitoes, and they bite, but what does their biting amount to? It itches a little, that's all. It won't endanger life." End quote. These are the words of one whose Bushido training was tried in the fiery furnace of adversity and triumph. The popular apothegm, quote, "To be beaten is to conquer," end quote, meaning true conquest consists in not opposing a riotous foe, and, quote, "The best won victory is that obtained without shedding of blood," end quote, and others of similar import, will show that, after all, the ultimate ideal of knighthood was peace. It was a great pity that this high ideal was left exclusively to priests and moralists to preach, while the samurai went on practicing and extolling martial traits. In this, they went so far as to tinge the ideals of womanhood with Amazonian character. Here we may profitably devote a few paragraphs to the subject of the training and position of woman. The female half of our species has sometimes been called the paragon of paradoxes, because the intuitive working of its mind is beyond the comprehension of men's, quote, "arithmetical understanding," end quote. The Chinese ideogram denoting, quote, "the mysterious," end quote, "the unknowable," end quote, consists of two parts, one meaning, quote, "young," end quote, and the other, quote, "woman," end quote, because the physical charms and delicate thoughts of the fair sex are above the coarse mental caliber of our sex to explain. In the Bushido ideal of woman, however, there is little mystery and only a seeming paradox. I have said that it was Amazonian, but that is only half the truth. Ideographically, the Chinese represent wife by a woman holding a broom, certainly not to brandish it offensively or defensively against her conjugal ally, neither for witchcraft, but for the more harmless uses for which the besom was first invented. The idea involved being thus not less homely than the etymological derivation of the English wife, weaver, and daughter, duitar, milkmaid. Without confining the sphere of woman's activity to Küche, Kirche, Kinder, as the present German Kaiser is said to do, the Bushido ideal of womanhood was preeminently domestic. These seeming contradictions, domesticity and Amazonian traits, are not inconsistent with the precepts of knighthood, as we shall see. Bushido being a teaching primarily intended for the masculine sex, the virtues it prized in woman were naturally far from being distinctly feminine. Winckelmann remarks that, quote, "the supreme beauty of Greek art is rather male than female," end quote. And Lecky adds that it was true in the moral conception of the Greeks as in their art. Bushido similarly praised those women most, quote, "who emancipated themselves from the frailty of their sex, and displayed a heroic fortitude worthy of the strongest and the bravest of men." End quote. Footnote: Lecky, History of European Morals, 2, page 383. End footnote. Young girls, therefore, were trained to repress their feelings, to indurate their nerves, to manipulate weapons, especially the long-handled sword called the naginata, so as to be able to hold their own against unexpected odds. Yet the primary motive for exercises of this martial character was not for use in the field. It was twofold, personal and domestic. Woman, owning no suzerain of her own, formed her own bodyguard. With her weapon she guarded her personal sanctity with as much zeal as her husband did his master's. The domestic utility of her warlike training was in the education of her sons, as we shall see later. Fencing and similar exercises, if rarely of practical use, were a wholesome counterbalance to the otherwise sedentary habits of woman. But these exercises were not followed only for hygienic purposes. They could be turned into use in times of need. Girls, when they reached womanhood, were presented with dirks, kaiken, pocket poniards, which might be directed to the bosom of their assailants, or, if advisable, to their own. The latter was very often the case, and yet I will not judge them severely. Even the Christian conscience, with its horror of self-immolation, will not be harsh with them, seeing Pelagia and Domnina, 2 suicides, were canonized for their purity and piety. When a Japanese Virginia saw her chastity menaced, she did not wait for her father's dagger. Her own weapon lay always in her bosom. It was a disgrace to her not to know the proper way in which she had to perpetrate self-destruction. For example, little as she was taught in anatomy, she must know the exact spot to cut her throat. She must know how to tie her lower limbs together with a belt, so that, whatever the agonies of death might be, her corpse be found in utmost modesty with the limbs properly composed. Is not a caution like this worthy of the Christian Perpetua or the Vestal Cornelia? I would not put such an abrupt interrogation were it not for a misconception based on our bathing customs and other trifles, that chastity is unknown among us. Footnote: For a very sensible explanation of nudity in bathing, see Fink's Lotos Time in Japan, pages 286 through 297. End footnote. On the contrary, chastity was a preeminent virtue of the samurai woman, held above life itself. A young woman taken prisoner, seeing herself in danger of violence at the hands of the rough soldiery, says she will obey their pleasure, provided she be first allowed to write a line to her sisters, whom war has dispersed in every direction. When the epistle is finished, off she runs to the nearest well and saves her honor by drowning. The letter she leaves behind ends with these verses, quote, "For fear lest clouds may dim her light, should she but graze this nether sphere, the young moon poised above the height doth hastily betake to flight." End quote. It would be unfair to give my readers an idea that masculinity alone was our highest ideal for woman. Far from it. Accomplishments and the gentler graces of life were required of them. Music, dancing, and literature were not neglected. Some of the finest verses in our literature were expressions of feminine sentiments. In fact, women played an important role in the history of the Japanese belles lettres. Dancing was taught, I am speaking of samurai girls, not of geisha, only to smooth the angularity of their movements. Music was to regale the weary hours of their fathers and husbands. Hence, it was not for the technique, the art as such, that music was learned, for the ultimate object was the purification of heart, since it was said that no harmony of sound is attainable without the player's heart being in harmony with herself. Here again we see the same idea prevailing which we notice in the training of youths, that accomplishments were ever kept subservient to moral worth. Just enough of music and dancing to add grace and brightness to life, but never to foster vanity and extravagance. I sympathize with the Persian prince who, when taken into a ballroom in London and asked to take part in the merriment, bluntly remarked that in his country they provided a particular set of girls to do that kind of business for them. The accomplishments of our women were not acquired for show or social ascendancy. They were a home diversion, and if they shone in social parties, it was as the attributes of a hostess. In other words, as a part of the household contrivances for hospitality. Domesticity guided their education. It may be said that the accomplishments of the women of old Japan, be they martial or pacific in character, were mainly intended for the home, and however far they might roam, they never lost sight of the hearth as the center. It was to maintain its honor and integrity that they slaved, drudged, and gave up their lives. Night and day, in tones at once firm and tender, brave and plaintive, they sang to their little nests. As daughter, woman sacrificed herself for her father, as wife for her husband, and as mother for her son. Thus, from earliest youth she was taught to deny herself. Her life was not one of independence, but of dependent service. Man's helpmeet, if her presence is helpful, she stays on the stage with him. If it hinders his work, she retires behind the curtain. Not infrequently does it happen that a youth becomes enamored of a maiden who returns his love with equal ardor, but when she realizes his interest in her makes him forgetful of his duties, disfigures her person, that her attractions may cease. Azuma, the ideal wife in the minds of samurai girls, finds herself loved by a man who, in order to win her affection, conspires against her husband. Upon pretense of joining in the guilty plot, she manages, in the dark, to take her husband's place, and the sword of the lover-assassin descends upon her own devoted head. The following epistle, written by the wife of a young daimyo before taking her own life, needs no comment. Quote, "Oft have I heard that no accident or chance ever mars the march of events here below, and that all moves in accordance with a plan. To take shelter under a common bough, or a drink of the same river, is alike ordained from ages prior to our birth. Since we were joined in ties of eternal wedlock, now 2 short years ago, my heart hath followed thee, even as its shadow followeth an object, inseparably bound heart to heart, loving and being loved. Learning but recently, however, that the coming battle is to be the last of thy labor and life, take the farewell greeting of thy loving partner. I have heard that Koyu, the mighty warrior of ancient China, lost a battle, loath to part with his favorite gu. Yoshinaka, too, brave as he was, brought disaster to his cause, too weak to bid prompt farewell to his wife. Why should I, to whom earth no longer offers hope or joy, why should I detain thee or thy thoughts by living? Why should I not, rather, await thee on the road which all mortal kind must sometime tread? Never, prithee, never forget the many benefits which our good master Hideyori hath heaped upon thee. The gratitude we owe him is as deep as the sea and as high as the hills." Woman's surrender of herself to the good of her husband, home, and family was as willing and honorable as the man's self-surrender to the good of his lord and country. Self-renunciation, without which no life enigma can be solved, was the keynote of the loyalty of man as well as of the domesticity of woman. She was no more the slave of man than was her husband of his liege lord, and the part she played was recognized as naijo, "the inner help." In the ascending scale of service stood woman, who annihilated herself for man, that he might annihilate himself for the master, that he in turn might obey heaven. I know the weakness of this teaching, and that the superiority of Christianity is nowhere more manifest than here, in that it requires of each and every living soul direct responsibility to its Creator. Nevertheless, as far as the doctrine of service, the serving of a cause higher than one's own self, even at the sacrifice of one's individuality, I say the doctrine of service, which is the greatest that Christ preached, and is the sacred keynote of his mission, as far as that is concerned, Bushido is based on eternal truth. My readers will not accuse me of undue prejudice in favor of slavish surrender of volition. I accept in a large measure the view advanced with breadth of learning and defended with profundity of thought by Hegel, that history is the unfolding and realization of freedom. The point I wish to make is that the whole teaching of Bushido was so thoroughly imbued with the spirit of self-sacrifice that it was required not only of woman but of man. Hence, until the influence of its precepts is entirely done away with, our society will not realize the view rashly expressed by an American exponent of women's rights, who exclaimed, "May all the daughters of Japan rise in revolt against ancient customs." Can such a revolt succeed? Will it improve the female status? Will the rights they gain by such a summary process repay the loss of that sweetness of disposition, that gentleness of manner, which are their present heritage? Was not the loss of domesticity on the part of Roman matrons followed by moral corruption too gross to mention? Can the American reformer assure us that a revolt of our daughters is the true course for their historical development to take? These are grave questions. Changes must and will come without revolts. In the meantime, let us see whether the status of the fair sex under the Bushido regimen was really so bad as to justify a revolt. We hear much of the outward respect European knights paid to, "God and the ladies," the incongruity of the two terms making Gibbon blush. We are also told by Hallam that the morality of chivalry was coarse, that gallantry implied illicit love. The effect of chivalry on the weaker vessel was food for reflection on the part of philosophers, Monsieur Guizot contending that feudalism and chivalry wrought wholesome influences, while Mr. Spencer tells us that, in a militant society, and what is feudal society if not militant, the position of woman is necessarily low, improving only as society becomes more industrial. Now, is M. Guizot's theory true of Japan, or is Mr. Spencer's? In reply, I might aver that both are right. The military class in Japan was restricted to the samurai, comprising nearly 2 million souls. Above them were the military nobles, the daimyo, and the court nobles, the kuge, these higher sybaritic nobles being fighters only in name. Below them were masses of the common people, mechanics, tradesmen, and peasants, whose life was devoted to arts of peace. Thus, what Herbert Spencer gives as the characteristics of a militant-type society may be said to have been exclusively confined to the samurai class, while those of the industrial type were applicable to the classes above and below it. This is well illustrated by the position of woman, for in no class did she experience less freedom than among the samurai. Strange to say, the lower the social class, as, for instance, among small artisans, the more equal was the position of husband and wife. Among the higher nobility, too, the difference in the relations of the sexes was less marked, chiefly because there were few occasions to bring the differences of sex into prominence, the leisurely nobleman having become literally effeminate. Thus Spencer's dictum was fully exemplified in old Japan. As to Guizot's, those who read his presentation of a feudal community will remember that he had the higher nobility especially under consideration, so that his generalization applies to the daimyo and the kuge. I shall be guilty of gross injustice to historical truth if my words give one a very low opinion of the status of woman under Bushido. I do not hesitate to state that she was not treated as man's equal, but until we learn to discriminate between difference and inequalities, there will always be misunderstandings upon this subject. When we think in how few respects men are equal among themselves, e.g., before law courts or voting polls, it seems idle to trouble ourselves with a discussion on the equality of sexes. When the American Declaration of Independence said that all men were created equal, it had no reference to their mental or physical gifts. It simply repeated what Ulpian long ago announced, that before the law all men are equal. Legal rights were, in this case, the measure of their equality. Were the law the only scale by which to measure the position of woman in a community, it would be as easy to tell where she stands as to give her avoirdupois in pounds and ounces. But the question is there a correct standard in comparing the relative social position of the sexes? Is it right, is it enough to compare woman's status to man's, as the value of silver is compared with that of gold, and give the ratio numerically? Such a method of calculation excludes from consideration the most important kind of value which a human being possesses, namely, the intrinsic. In view of the manifold variety of requisites for making each sex fulfill its earthly mission, the standard to be adopted in measuring its relative position must be of a composite character, or, to borrow from economic language, it must be a multiple standard. Bushido had a standard of its own, and it was binomial. It tried to gauge the value of woman on the battlefield and by the hearth. There she counted for very little, here for all. The treatment accorded her corresponded to this double measurement. As a social-political unit, not much, while as wife and mother she received highest respect and deepest affection. Why, among so military a nation as the Romans, were their matrons so highly venerated? Was it not because they were matrona, mothers? Not as fighters or lawgivers, but as their mothers did men bow before them. So with us. While fathers and husbands were absent in field or camp, the government of the household was left entirely in the hands of mothers and wives. The education of the young, even their defense, was entrusted to them. The warlike exercises of women, of which I have spoken, were primarily to enable them intelligently to direct and follow the education of their children. I have noticed a rather superficial notion prevailing among half-informed foreigners that because the common Japanese expression for one's wife is, quote, "my rustic wife," end quote, and the like, she is despised and held in little esteem. When it is told that such phrases as, quote, "my foolish father," end quote, "my swinish son," end quote, "my awkward self," end quote, etc., are in current use, is not the answer clear enough? To me, it seems that our idea of marital union goes in some ways further than the so-called Christian. Quote, "Man and woman shall be one flesh," end quote. The individualism of the Anglo-Saxon cannot let go of the idea that husband and wife are two persons. Hence, when they disagree, their separate rights are recognized, and when they agree, they exhaust their vocabulary in all sorts of silly pet names and nonsensical blandishments. It sounds highly irrational to our ears when a husband or wife speaks to a third party of his other half, better or worse, as being lovely, bright, kind, and what not. Is it good taste to speak of oneself as, quote, "my bright self," end quote, "my lovely disposition," end quote, and so forth? We think praising one's own wife or one's own husband is praising a part of one's own self, and self-praise is regarded, to say the least, as bad taste among us, and I hope among Christian nations too. I have diverged at some length, because the polite debasement of one's consort was a usage most in vogue among the samurai. The Teutonic races, beginning their tribal life with a superstitious awe of the fair sex, though this is really wearing off in Germany, and the Americans beginning their social life under the painful consciousness of the numerical insufficiency of women, footnote, I refer to those days when girls were imported from England and given in marriage for so many pounds of tobacco, etc., end footnote, who, now increasing, are, I am afraid, fast losing the prestige their colonial mothers enjoyed. The respect man pays to woman has, in Western civilization, become the chief standard of morality. But in the martial ethics of Bushido, the main watershed dividing the good and the bad was sought elsewhere. It was located along the line of duty which bound man to his own divine soul, and then to other souls, in the 5 relations I have mentioned in the early part of this paper. Of these we have brought to our readers' notice loyalty, the relation between one man as vassal and another as lord. Upon the rest I have only dwelt incidentally as occasion presented itself, because they were not peculiar to Bushido. Being founded on natural affections, they could but be common to all mankind, though in some particulars they may have been accentuated by conditions which its teachings induced. In this connection there comes before me the peculiar strength and tenderness of friendship between man and man, which often added to the bond of brotherhood a romantic attachment doubtless intensified by the separation of the sexes in youth, a separation which denied to affection the natural channel open to it in Western chivalry or in the free intercourse of Anglo-Saxon lands. I might fill pages with Japanese versions of the story of Damon and Pythias, or Achilles and Patroclus, or tell in Bushido parlance of ties as sympathetic as those which bound David and Jonathan. It is not surprising, however, that the virtues and teachings unique in the precepts of knighthood did not remain circumscribed to the military class. This makes us hasten to the consideration of the influence of Bushido on the nation at large. End of section 7.